Yes, well, Hintergrundgeschichte is a long German word which essentially means the historical background to the works of art that we are looking at, in this case Baselitz. And it's a really important word with Baselitz because he's an artist, I think more than any other, who's really made his awareness of the whole history of art part of his work. And you see it as he moves through the decades. His interests change. So first he's very interested in mannerism, then he becomes more interested in other forms of art, and his interest seems to broaden and broaden and broaden. And he collects not only African sculpture, but also lots of contemporary art, the art of his peers. And so, on the one hand, it's art historical background, but perhaps the most important thing with Baselitz is the actual historical background, and the fact that he came out of a period, the Second World War, where Germany ceased to exist as a country for 4 years, which was traumatic if you were German, not to talk about the destruction of the country by Allied bombs. And I think on the one hand you could say this is traumatic, but actually for an artist this is rich material. And he was part of a generation of artists who emerged from the Second World War, and I think really took it as their subject in so many different and so many interesting ways, but ways which sort of interrogate history, which try to make sense of it, turning art into almost a sort of therapy, you might say. So these are the two different ways in which I think history is background to what Baselitz does. The last thing to say there is you might not think that by looking at his works, because they often seem quite detached from history. They seem to be quite free-floating, quite literally, figures floating in space. But it's always there if you just have to look a bit harder and understand the larger context in which individual works exist. I think it has changed quite a lot. I mean, the earliest series of paintings and prints and drawings known as the hero paintings are very direct images of what he was seeing in Germany after the war. Russian soldiers were coming over, German soldiers returning, and making reference to the iconography of warfare and the iconography of the post-war world. So very direct, and also taking quite directly from the artists he was interested in at the time, the Mannerist artists, but also artists who'd been making what is called chiaroscuro woodcuts in a slightly earlier period. It was a technique he effectively single-handedly revived. I think nowadays, and as you look through his work over the decades, that sense of the past becomes somehow more deeply embedded in what he does, becomes much more fundamental. And it's as if sometimes you can look at a painting by Baselitz and see the entire history of art crystallized into this image. It's all these connections are there. Yes, I think there are. I mean, the references build up and build up. The wonderful collage stockings are so much like, Kurt Schwitter's, his use of everyday materials, transform them into something else, or Hannah Herk, also a great Dada collage artist, or the American artist Robert Rauschenberg. And these are all references which you can make, but they're not. I don't think he's taking anything directly. I think the relationship Baselitz has with the past is always to create a little gap, a little distance, out of humility maybe, and also respect. And I think that's what I see in this exhibition, is the spectacle of an artist who almost has the entire history of art in his head and is creating works of art on that basis, never emulating, never copying, always creating a new, fresh image. The interesting thing about that question is that I think there are almost two different types of works of art. A work of art which makes you see the world in a different way. You see the painting in the gallery and you go out and somehow the world looks like the painting. And works of art which make you see other works of art in different ways. I think Baselitz is definitely the second category. And certainly in some of the exhibitions he's curated of his works, he'll put his painting next to a painting by Titian or Cranach or the Netherlandish painter Bartholomew Spranger, maybe an artist you hadn't heard of, but suddenly you see it in a new way, because you're seeing it through Baselitz's eyes. So I think he does, in that sense, he does affect the way we see the past of art. But I think also he's such an independent figure and such a sort of stubborn figure in many respects that actually what you're seeing with Baselitz is often him looking at his own work and challenging himself. There's a great sort of interior monologue going on with Baselitz's work. It has a sort of, I suppose, a sense of being quite, as I said before, cut off from the world around it, aware of it, but in its own domain. As for how it might affect art history or art historical views of the past, I think I'm not sure it does really a great deal, but the one thing I always get from Baselitz's paintings is to realize how much every painting is a spontaneous act, it's an improvisation. No matter how much a painting might be planned, the actual meat of a painting, the reason it's a great work of art, is something which is performed on a canvas just like that, or on a piece of wood. And that's what Baselitz does over and over again. And here it reminds you of that, how fresh the old masters must have appeared when they were first made, and how spontaneous and how spontaneous the act of creating anything is.